By the time I understood what my husband was really doing, I was already sitting alone with a cancer diagnosis, sore from surgery, and somehow still carrying the weight of the house on my back. That is the part that bothered me most. Not just that he was there physically, but that every single moment I needed him to show up, he acted like my fear was an inconvenience. I kept thinking there had to be some hidden reason, some explanation that would make it make sense. But when you look back at it honestly, the pattern was already there from the beginning. The appointments I went to alone. The short, empty replies when I tried to talk. The way he could make a commitment to friends, but somehow never make one to the woman going through cancer beside him. That is how this story really starts. Not with the surgery. With the quiet realization that I was fighting for my life inside a marriage that was already leaving me behind. I tried to tell myself I was being too emotional, that maybe he just did not know how to respond to something this serious. A lot of people tell themselves that at first. They soften the truth because the full truth is harder to survive. So I kept showing up to imaging, biopsy, and every other appointment alone, hoping that if he saw how scared I was, something in him would wake up. Instead, I got little dismissive replies, like he was answering a stranger at the store. Heck yeah. Cool. Nothing that sounded like concern. Nothing that sounded human. And that is where the psychology gets ugly, because when someone gives you just enough attention to keep you hoping, you start doing all the emotional work for both people. You start making excuses for them. You start translating indifference into stress, silence into discomfort, absence into harmlessness. But indifference during a cancer diagnosis is not harmless. It is a message. The night before my results, he had a DJ event at a bar with friends, and I told him straight up that I needed him to stay home with me because I was terrified. I was not asking for luxury. I was asking for presence. Instead, he told me he had made a commitment. That word kept coming back like a bad joke. Commitment to friends. Commitment to a bar. Commitment to a night out. But when it came to the woman who was waiting to hear whether she had cancer, suddenly commitment became flexible, optional, and somehow not urgent enough. I went with him because I did not want to find out the results alone. And that decision exposed something painful. I was already shrinking myself to fit inside his priorities. At the bar, one of his friend's wives told me she was pregnant. I forced a smile and tried to be happy for her, even though it hit me like a punch because I knew I would never have the same easy hope again. He already knew she was pregnant. He knew I would hear that news right before finding out I had a 2-centimeter tumor on my cervix. And when the reality finally landed, I ended up crying upstairs alone while he stayed busy with his friends. That is the moment I wish I had paid more attention to. Not because of the tears. Because of the silence around them. After that, the surgery should have been the turning point. If a person has ever loved you in a real way, that is the kind of day that exposes it. I had a LEEP procedure and a biopsy of the tumor under general anesthesia. When I woke up, I was foggy, sore, and vulnerable. He said he had a toothache. It sounds almost unreal when I say it out loud, but while I was trying to recover from a procedure connected to cancer, I spent my post-op time helping him find a dentist and manage his pain. That is what emotional imbalance looks like when it becomes normal. You stop asking who needs care more. You just start giving, because that is what you have been trained to do in the relationship. At discharge, the nurse tried to explain my instructions to him because I was still out of it, but he was scrolling Instagram. I had to call his name multiple times just to get him to sign the paperwork. Think about that for a second. That is not forgetfulness. That is not being bad at hospitals. That is a person choosing distraction over responsibility while his wife is barely awake after surgery. And once you see that clearly, it becomes harder to unsee. I asked if we could go to Olive Garden afterward because my mom used to take me for food after hard days, and I needed something familiar, something gentle, something that felt like comfort instead of fear. He reluctantly agreed, but he barely spoke the whole time. Every time I tried to talk, the conversation died in his mouth before it could even begin. So I sat there in silence, trying not to cry, while the room around us kept moving like everything was normal. That is one of the cruelest parts of emotional neglect. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just a series of tiny refusals. A look away. A one-word answer. A phone screen. A bad mood. A person making you feel like even your pain has bad timing. When we got home, he sat on the couch watching YouTube while I handled the nightly chores, let the dogs out, and struggled through my post-op care. I was physically wrecked and still digging through laundry baskets for reusable pads I had already asked him to wash. He had never taken them out of the dryer in the basement. I do not think people understand how humiliating it feels when your body is failing you and your partner makes you work for basic help like you are asking for a favor instead of survival. Then came the final insult, the part that showed me this was not confusion anymore. It was character. Weeks before the procedure, I had made it clear I needed help afterward, and he agreed. But apparently the toothache changed everything. He went to the pharmacy and picked up medication for his own pain, but not the prescriptions my dentist and oncologist had ordered for me. That alone would have been enough for most people to wake up. But then he got upset about my car, the $3,000 beater I bought a few months ago that needs a radiator. He was angry that I was not driving it, even though he uses the nicer Jeep my mom bought for me and my son every day while I walk to work. So now, in the middle of cancer treatment, he was mad that I was not managing a broken car the way he wanted, while also expecting me to carry his pain, his errands, his moods, and his comfort. That is when the emotional truth became impossible to deny. He was not just uninvolved. He was centered on himself in a way that left no room for me at all. And when I finally told him I was not going to argue about the car that day because I had just gotten out of surgery and was in pain, I realized something cold and simple. The scariest part of this marriage was not that he did not understand what I was going through. It was that he understood enough to know I was vulnerable, and still chose himself anyway. This is why the story stays with me. Not because one man was careless on one bad day. But because the pattern was so consistent it stopped looking like a mistake and started looking like a decision. When someone shows you who they are during the worst moment of your life, believe them. Cancer strips everything down to the truth. It shows you who can carry fear with you, and who only knows how to stand beside you when life is easy, and light, and convenient. I think that is the real heartbreak here. Not just the diagnosis, but the loneliness inside it. Not just the surgery, but the realization that I was healing in a house where nobody seemed to notice I was hurting. And once that kind of truth lands, there is no going back to pretending it is normal. Some people do not become selfish in crisis. They were always selfish. Crisis just removes the mask.